Take a look at this. A small flat island lying inside the chain of barrier islands that protect the coast of North Carolina from the open Atlantic. Less than 10 square miles of marsh and pine and brown shallow water. From the air it looks like nothing. A national park, a holiday spot, a piece of coastal land you could paddle around in an afternoon. But here, on this little patch of earth, more than 4 centuries ago, a small group of English men, women, and children walked into the trees one day and were never seen again. They left behind one word, carved into the bark of a tree. They left behind a baby girl who was 3 days old when she arrived. And they left behind a grandfather who searched for them until the day he died. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. When I first found this story on a map, I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't curiosity. It was a quiet kind of grief. Because once you know what really happened on this island, you can't unsee it. This is where America almost began, 20 years before the Pilgrims, the first English settlement in the New World, the first English baby ever born on American soil, the first place where two cultures, English and Algonquian, sat down together and tried to understand each other in the same language. And then, for reasons no living human has ever known with certainty, every single one of them walked off the map. This is Roanoke Island, and this is the story of America's first goodbye. It started in 1584. Queen Elizabeth I gave Sir Walter Raleigh permission to find England a foothold in the New World, and Raleigh sent 2 captains across the Atlantic to scout. They landed on Roanoke Island in July of that year, and they were welcomed. 2 young men from the local Algonquian tribes, a chief's son named Manteo, and another young man named Wanchese, agreed to sail back to London with them. They stood in front of Queen Elizabeth in her royal court that autumn, wearing brown English taffeta instead of the deerskins they had grown up in. A scholar named Thomas Harriot sat with them for months, building the first written dictionary of an American language. Manteo loved the English. Wanchese, after a while, hated them. 2 boys, 2 paths. And almost everything that came after on this island can be traced to which path each one chose. The first attempt to settle Roanoke, in 1585, fell apart. 100 soldiers, no women, no farmers. They argued with the local people, burned a village over a stolen cup, and went home a year later, broken and hungry. Raleigh tried one more time. He recruited families this time. Carpenters and tailors and bakers and their wives and their children. Among them was John White, a painter and mapmaker who had been on the first expedition. White's daughter Eleanor was pregnant. Her husband Ananias Dare was a tiler from London. They had married at St. Bride's Church on Fleet Street, in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, and now they were boarding a ship the size of a school bus to cross the Atlantic with their unborn child. They were supposed to settle at Chesapeake Bay. The land was better there. But the Portuguese pilot they had hired was a privateer at heart, and he wanted to chase Spanish ships, not babysit colonists. When they got to Roanoke in July of 1587, he dropped them off and refused to take them further. They were stranded. On the 13th of August that summer, Manteo was baptized into the Church of England, right there on the beach. He became the first Native American ever brought into the English faith. 5 days later, on the 18th of August, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Virginia, after the name the English had given to the land they were trying to settle. She was the first English child ever born on its soil. 2 cultures, 2 firsts, 1 week. For a few quiet days in the late summer of 1587, on this little island, it seemed like something beautiful might be possible. Then John White had to leave. The colony was short on supplies, and someone had to sail back to England before winter. The other colonists begged him to be the one. He agreed. On the 27th of August, 10 days after his granddaughter was born, he kissed his daughter goodbye, held the baby one more time, and walked onto the ship that would carry him home. He thought he would be back in a few months. He had no way of knowing that the world was about to end. When John White arrived back in England in the autumn of 1587, the country was preparing for war. King Philip of Spain was assembling the largest naval invasion fleet in European history, the Spanish Armada, and Queen Elizabeth ordered every English ship to stay in port for the defense of the realm. White begged. He pleaded. He was granted 2 tiny supply ships the Navy didn't want. They sailed in the spring of 1588, made it to the coast of Morocco, and were attacked by French pirates. 12 of his crew were lost. The supplies meant for Roanoke were taken. The ships limped back to England. The Spanish Armada was defeated that summer, but the order keeping English ships at home stayed in force. White waited. He watched the seasons turn from his rented rooms in London, while somewhere across the ocean his daughter and his granddaughter were having birthdays. Without him, he did not get back to Roanoke for 3 years. When he finally sailed in 1590, it was on a privateering ship far more interested in plundering Spanish vessels than in finding a lost colony. The voyage took 5 months. White stood on the deck every day, watching the horizon, terrified of what he might find. On the 18th of August 1590, the ship anchored off Roanoke Island. It was Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. John White walked up the beach toward where the fort had been. The houses were gone, the timbers carefully taken down and carried away. There was no sign of struggle, no bodies, no belongings scattered in the sand. The settlement had simply ended. And then he saw it. Carved into the bark of a tree at the edge of the clearing, in clean Roman letters, the word CRO, and further on one of the great wooden posts of the palisade, in deeper, fuller letters, the word Croatoan. Croatoan was the island 50 miles south of Roanoke. It was Manteo's home. White and the colonists had agreed, before he left, that if they ever had to move, they would carve the name of where they were going. And if they were in any danger, they would also carve a cross beside the name. There was no cross. White stood there on the empty beach, with the wind coming off the sound, and he allowed himself to hope. They had not died here. They had gone to live with Manteo, the man he had baptized 3 summers ago on this same shore. They were on Croatoan Island, 50 miles south. They were alive. He turned to the ship. He begged them to sail south. That night, a storm came in off the ocean. The anchor broke. The ship was dragged into deep water and could not turn back. They drifted for days until they saw the Azores rising out of the sea, 1,000 miles from where they should have been. By the time anyone in England knew what had happened, it was too late in the year to try again. John White went home. He never set foot on American soil again for the rest of his life. He retired to a small cottage on Sir Walter Raleigh's estates in County Cork, Ireland. He wrote one final letter, 3 years later, to the historian Richard Hakluyt, in which he tried to set down what he had seen. He used the phrase, "the evils and unfortunate events that had ruined his hopes in the New World." He died not long after that, alone, in a country that wasn't his, looking out at the Atlantic from the wrong side. He never knew what had become of Eleanor. He never knew if Virginia had grown up. That should have been the end of the story. For 400 years it was. The colonists became known as the Lost Colony. School children in America are still taught about them every autumn. The word Croatoan passed into folklore, scrawled in graffiti, used in novels and movies as a kind of magic word for things that disappear. People came up with wild theories. Some said the Spanish. Some said the local tribes. Some said the colonists had become a tribe of light-skinned Indians somewhere in the Carolina pines. Nobody could ever prove anything. The mystery just sat there, year after year, like an unanswered letter on a kitchen table. And then, in 2012, 2 researchers from a small foundation in North Carolina asked the British Museum to look at the back of a single watercolor painting. It was a map John White himself had drawn in 1585, his own careful sketch of the coast of Virginia. And there were 2 small paper patches glued onto it, the size of coins, that nobody had looked under in 400 years. The curators held the map up to a strong light from behind, and they saw, drawn in faint invisible ink that had been hidden under those patches for 4 centuries, the outline of 2 forts. Forts that did not exist on any other map. Forts on a piece of land 50 miles inland from Roanoke. 50 miles. Exactly the distance the colonists had told John White they were planning to move the night before he left them. Archaeologists started digging at the spot a few months later in a quiet patch of farmland on Salmon Creek. They found Elizabethan pottery. They found English brass. They found things no other Native American site in America has ever produced. And right next to it, they found a village of the Roanoke people who had lived there for generations. Then the DNA tests started coming back. There is a community of people in eastern North Carolina, 3 hours inland from Roanoke, called the Lumbee. For 400 years they have insisted, in their own oral history, that some of their ancestors were English colonists. They have light eyes. Some of them carry last names that match the names on the 1587 colony list. The Hatteras Indians on Manteo's old island tell the same story. Modern genetic testing has now found European markers in the DNA of those communities that point straight back to the 16th century. To a small group of people who walked off Roanoke Island one summer day and were never seen again, they were not lost. They were never lost. They walked west and they walked south, and they walked into the houses and the families of the people who lived here long before any of us did. They had children. Those children had children. Some of those children are alive today. Some of them are watching this video. This is the part of the story that nobody told John White, the part he died never knowing. His daughter Eleanor probably did live. His granddaughter Virginia probably did grow up. Somewhere in the woods of North Carolina, by a creek that had no English name, a little girl with English blood learned to speak Algonquian. Somewhere in a village under the pines, an old woman with gray eyes told her grandchildren about a man with a paintbrush who had once tried to come back for her and could not. When I think about Roanoke now, I do not think of a mystery anymore. I think of a family. A grandfather who waited his whole life for a letter that never came, and a baby girl who, on her 3rd birthday, was so far from where her grandfather thought she would be that he could not find her with all the ships of England. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest stories, and this little island holds more than almost anywhere I have ever read about. It held the first English baby ever born in this country. It held the first Native American to be welcomed into the English faith. And it held a goodbye that took 400 years to answer. If you've ever heard of the Lost Colony, or know someone with Lumbee or Hatteras ancestry, let me know in the comments, and let me know where I should go next. See you in the next one.